The Problem with Seduction. The Naughty Girls, Book 2. Written by Emma Locke. Narrated by Marian Hussey. Chapter 1. August 1814, London. Surely this was the first and only time Lord Constantine Alexander would ever approach another man and utter the words, "Pardon me, sir, but I believe you have my baby." Activities at the closest gaming tables ceased. Patrons leaned forward in anticipation of witnessing a scene that would no doubt be fodder for the better part of the night, if not the week. Con had no idea how Captain Nicholas Finn would reply to his claim, or if the larger, more seasoned man would even use words. An accusation like the one Con had made could end in fisticuffs, or a call for his second. Con would really rather not be shot tonight. Captain Finn's mouth slowly snapped shut. His brown eyes narrowed. Otherwise, he maintained control. "Who the hell are you?" "Lord Constantine Alexander, at your service." Con tightened his grimace into a proper smirk. A man who just claimed to have impregnated another man's mistress would smirk, wouldn't he? Otherwise, if he were not a cocky cad intent on embarrassing his opponent, he would have done it all in private. "Well, do you or don't you have my son?" Con demanded. Finn didn't respond. Con was careful not to twitch his fingertips against his leg. He must look sure. He couldn't afford to fail his mission, and that meant the captain couldn't have any reason to doubt his claim. Con did his best to look arrogant. "By my counting, you do." Finn thumped his empty tumbler onto the gaming table, then he rose to his feet. Even standing, he had to tilt his head back to glare up at Con. "I don't need to count backward to know my own son," Finn growled, stepping closer. "Measure twice, cut once, or so my tailor always says." Con chuckled into the man's face, though he didn't feel like smiling, far from it. But appearances had to be maintained. He wouldn't see a shilling until the baby in question was returned to its mother. That was the first stipulation of his bounty. Then the £10,000 he'd receive after the child's successful recovery would stop the moneylenders in their tracks. He needed this to work. It all added up to his freedom. Each reassuring zero guaranteed he wouldn't have to spend another night in King's Bench, the debtors' prison that all but had his name etched into a cell wall. If he failed at this, there'd be no second chance for him. He grinned again, as if the rest of his life didn't hinge on the next few moments. "I believe this has been a misunderstanding from the start," he explained, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Please, allow me to set the events in question straight so there can be no doubt." He must leave Finn with no recourse. That was the second stipulation. The men in this room must be tantalised enough to spread word of this debacle across every club in London, leaving Finn no possibility of reneging. It was up to Con to make this confrontation between them as salacious and believable as possible. "4 months ago," he said, his voice booming in the silent room, "you were summoned to a tiny hamlet in Devon by the notorious courtesan Elizabeth Spencer, who had been your mistress for the majority of 3 years. You were presented with an infant you were told had sprung from your loins. Do I have the right of it so far?" Finn didn't spare a glance for the onlookers watching with unabashed interest. He didn't stop to suggest that he and Con should retreat out of earshot. Instead, his eyes bored into Con's with an intensity that made it hard not to squirm, as if he cared, with every iota of feeling in him about what Con was saying, as if his whole life hung in the balance. Con felt the first twinge of guilt. "Well," he continued, when Finn's only reply was a deepening of that discomforting stare, "why did you think she was in Devon? It wasn't to see her family. They live in Shropshire. And besides, I hear they aren't on speaking.
What are you trying to say?
Finn bellowed. Con really didn't want to be shot tonight. But if he had to choose between a bullet and the jail, a very real choice he might be making in the morning, the bullet won. The damp, dark cell at King's Bench weighed on his lungs. Just remembering that cold, dirty hellhole sent ice through his veins. His fear helped him to sound beleaguered, as though it pained him to explain what he'd hoped would be obvious by this point. I live in Devon. She went to Devon to have my baby. That's what I'm trying to say. Their audience's collective gasp was quickly followed by a round of, "I say," and one, "Really? That was not well done of you, Alexander." Red splotches mottled Captain Finn's tanned face as he strained to loom over Con.
That's absurd. Elizabeth panted after my attentions for 3 years. She never would have.
But he stopped. Con barely kept from sagging. Oh, God. He'd done it. He'd planted the seed of doubt. Finn advanced a step, testing Con's ability to stand his ground.
She's my mistress, not yours. You cowardly, bloody whelp. I demand your retraction.
He swung his arm wide and Con flinched, belatedly realizing Finn had meant to use his arm to indicate the gaming hell's occupants, not plant Con a facer.
None of you laid a hand on her. Not in the last 3 years. You wouldn't dare. She's mine. Elizabeth Spencer is mine.
A choked cough somewhere in the back of the room drew a new level of silence. Awkwardness hung in the air, as each man struggled to decide if it had been a throat tickle or a smothered admission of guilt. Finn spun in the direction of the cough. Finally freed of that drilling stare, Con breathed easier. Yet his heart thumped in his chest so hard, surely everyone could hear it. The child wasn't in Con's arms, yet. He wasn't clear of King's Bench, yet.
Who did that? Finn demanded. Which one of you snivelling bastards wants to join young Alexander here in a fist-pounding?
Seconds of silence felt like minutes. Con resisted the urge to shift uneasily. The notion that he'd fathered the child rather than Captain Finn wasn't that far-fetched. Elizabeth was a courtesan. She needn't remain faithful to a man who spent half his life disparaging her and the other half sailing the oceans. In his absences, she might take a legion of bedfellows without his knowing a whit of it. Whether or not she had done so, Con really wasn't in a position to know. He'd first spoken to her 3 days earlier, when she'd found him in a gaming hell and presented him with this plot. But if even one more man would come forward with an admission, his task would be so much easier. The silence held. Finn turned to face him.
See? You're a liar.
She isn't your mistress now, though, is she? Con taunted. His steady voice surprised him, since he could have sworn Finn's boot was already pressing on his throat. And she hasn't always been. You've given her up a time or two. She tries your nerves. Finn glowered, but he didn't dispute what was only fact. Con eased his stance. As he'd done with every creditor who'd ever dogged him, he feigned nonchalance. You replaced her most recently with Millicent Kimball. A delectable piece, I credit you, as was Mrs. Brooks before her. And a little over a year ago, if I may relate your history aloud, you were keen on Beth Rawlings. I can't fault your taste, Finn, but I must say, women do have a strong dislike of being jilted. Murmurs of agreement wound through the room. By my math, Con said again, feeling surer of himself the longer Finn remained quiet, the child you've been tricked into acknowledging is actually mine. I am sorry, old boy, but if you don't mind, I'd like my son back. He was the cutest little imp when he was born, and I will never forgive myself for quarrelling with Elizabeth just a few days later. He laughed quietly, as if they shared a secret. It's too easy, is it not, to rile her passions? I ought to have minded my tongue when she was at her most vulnerable. I sent her running back to you instead." Finn's eyes darkened, the leathery skin of his brow creasing. He was assessing Con's claim, and he didn't like his conclusion. Con stood straighter. He was a devil of a handsome man, an objective evaluation based on his observation that his twin brother was an out-and-out rogue. Finn was realizing the crux of it now. Con was worthy competition, and beautiful, self-made Elizabeth Spencer did not like to be crossed. Con almost felt sorry for the man. He couldn't take too much time to pity his opponent, though. He didn't have her baby yet. Only when Finn stormed out of the room growling,
"That duplicitous little slut! I'll be damned if she sneaks your bastard under my nose!"
did Con finally ease his rigid stance. And the next morning, when a runner knocked at the door of Merritt House, rousing the staff with the announcement that a baby was to be delivered that afternoon, the dread in Con's belly began to unfurl. But it was the £10,000 quietly transferred into his accounts that fully unwound his insides and allowed him to take an unfettered breath. When the last IOU had been ripped asunder, and even the least of the creditors was satisfied, Con exhaled a deep sigh of relief. He even had a few coins to spare. Coins he might not have much longer, as he was in the mood to celebrate his own resourcefulness. Until he returned to Merritt House, and his mother greeted him at the foot of the stairs.
"Constantine!"
she cried.
"Where on earth have you hidden my little grandchild? Mr. Benjamin seems to think you've no intention of raising him here, but I told him that cannot be true. You wouldn't keep your own son from his family?"
Her blue eyes filled with tears.
"Oh, Constantine, you wouldn't, would you? You'd never be so cruel."
He opened his mouth to reply, but he had nothing to say. He stared at his mother, powerless to reassure her that no, he wasn't that kind of father. The uncaring kind. The absent kind. The kind his father had been. It was his first indication that, perhaps, he hadn't thought this scheme entirely through.